afternoon, everyone. My name is Cliff Chapman. I am the Director of Provincial Operations for BC Wildfire Service. I'm honored to join you today from the Provincial Wildfire Coordination Centre in Kamloops, BC, on the traditional territory of the Tecumloops to Secwepemc people, where me and my family live, work, and play. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Matt MacDonald, who's the lead weather forecaster for BC Wildfire Service. And together, we're going to go over a bit of a seasonal overview of what's happened to date in BC when it comes to wildfires and fire on the landscape. And Matt's going to focus in on the next 10 days of weather as we see another system coming in that may increase our fire load across the province. And we wanted to do a session today to talk about preparedness and talk about what we can expect in the next 10 days. First off, I want to acknowledge how difficult this fire season has been so far. We just surpassed 1 million hectares burned across the province. Predominantly, that has been focused in the northeast of the province in what we call our Prince George Fire Center, which stretches from really Quesnel up to the Yukon Northwest Territories border. That's where the majority of our fire activity has been to date. Crossing over the 1 million hectare threshold this early in the season is quite significant. It now ranks as the third most hectares burned in any fire season in BC since we started to track. And obviously we're in July, we're in early July. And so we have the potential for our hot and dry months, July, August, and into September, to see even more fire on the landscape and potentially more new starts with lightning and warm weather coming in, which Matt will speak to. I think it's important to talk a little bit about this past long weekend. We did do some information bulletins ahead of the weekend, and we did see 45 new starts over the Canada Day long weekend. The majority of those starts were lightning caused, and thanks to the diligent reporting of the public, which is one of our primary sources for detecting new fires, we were able to get 35 of those 46 fires into being held or out stage, which is a fairly good success given the conditions that we face in BC at the current time. So I want to thank the public for being diligent in reporting smokes that you see on the land base. We really encourage and need the support of the public reporting in fires. If you see smoke, please call the 1-800 number or star 555 on your cell phone, and we will respond. Even if you think that fire has already been called in, we encourage you to please dial that number and give us a heads up, because we will let you know if we think it's an existing fire, and we will send resources if it's not. Human caused prevention is a critical piece in BC as we move into warming and drying conditions that we've seen already 2 or 3 times through the spring. We really need to expect that July and August could be hot and dry for the entire 2 months. We may see very limited rain, and we will see what would be deemed more of a typical summer for British Columbia, maybe even atypical if we see seasonal temperatures rising above what would be normal. With that, I want to just let the public know that we are expanding our prohibitions. You'll recall a few weeks ago that we did expand our prohibitions in some fire centers to include campfires. We're going to be expanding our prohibitions again this Friday. I would encourage everyone in BC to please check bcwildfire.ca to ensure you are aware of what prohibitions are in place for the area in which you are working, living, playing in before you decide if you can have a fire. The prohibitions are listed on our website, and I encourage everybody to please go there. In terms of the fire season, I think it's important to note that the North, in particular the Northeast, has been really impacted by wildfires so far this year. The fire season started early. It was the middle of April, and we haven't seen a break in the Northeast. There has been days where they've seen a little bit of rain, but not nearly enough to have an impact on the fires that are on the landscape, as well as potentially new starts from lightning and or human-caused activity. The communities in the North, the First Nation communities in the North, our staff that have been working tirelessly for the last 2 months have had to deal with the anxiety of smoke, the anxiety of fire, the impacts of fire to communities, to industry, to people's livelihoods. And I want to thank everybody for being so welcoming to the BC Wildfire Service, to our staff that are out there working tirelessly to try to support the efforts on the ground, in conjunction with the First Nation and local governments, in conjunction with the communities. And all reports is that it's been extremely welcoming for BC Wildfire Service, our contracted resources that we have hundreds of out on the fire line right now and up in the air. So I just want to thank everybody and recognize that there's been a lot of anxiety, in particular in the north. And what we're going to see in the next 2 weeks is we're going to see more potential fire on the landscape spread from the north to the south with new starts with anticipated lightning each day. So I encourage everybody to be extremely cautious as we go through the rest of this week and really for the rest of the summer. There is resource challenges across Canada, across the United States. We continually try to access additional resources, not because we're out in BC at this point, but because we want to ensure that we have enough resources to rest our staff at appropriate intervals. And with that, I will say I want to thank the United States, who's sending us an additional 60 personnel tomorrow, and Mexico, which will be sending us an additional 100 firefighters in the next 2 days. Those resources will help support our fire suppression efforts in the north, allowing us the ability to rest some of our own staff, and also allowing us the ability to have preparedness resources ready for new starts in the south. So we really appreciate the support from other countries and other parts of other parts of Canada. We really can't do it without the support of local contractors, First Nation, local governments, as well as now what we're seeing is more of that global firefighting effort. I'll touch a little bit more on preparedness, but I want to just throw it over to Matt MacDonald, our lead fire weather forecaster, so he can dive into a little bit more detail on the forecast for the next 7 to 10 days.
Great. Thank you, Cliff, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for the floor time this afternoon. Pleasure to be with you, and I'm fortunate to be presenting to you this afternoon from the beautiful traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, the Sayelks, and the Sinixt First Nation people in the West Kootenays. Before we get into the outlook, it's always practical to look back on recent events and see how the last month has played out in terms of weather. And I'm sure you'll all recall it was a very warm and dry June. And these two images speak to that hot, dry June. On the left-hand side, we have our average temperatures for the month of June over Western Canada. And you'll notice the shades of yellow that speak to temperature anomalies being 1 to 2 degrees warmer than normal. And that might not sound super exceptional, but over a 30-day period, if we add up all those daily averages, it actually is noteworthy. On the right-hand side, pairing to that warm weather was also a very dry period. And the shades of brown covering most of the province indicate precipitation amounts that were 70 to 80% less than normal. So not only was it warm, but it was dry. So we've seen those drought conditions that we've been speaking to you since the beginning of the season really persist and in fact deepen as we get into the core of our fire season here. Working closely with our partners at Environment and Climate Change Canada, they've shared with us their latest monthly and seasonal guidance. And on the screen here, you can see shades of red really across the entirety of Canada for the next month. So this represents the potential for temperatures to be above normal from mid-July right through the middle of August. So really the core of our fire season. And so we have pretty good confidence that these warm temperatures that we've been seeing are going to persist as we head into the second half of July and the beginning of August. From a precipitation perspective, same idea here. The potential for drier than normal conditions are likely to persist through the latter half of July and into August. So not only will it continue to be warm, but most likely continue to be dry. It's worth pointing out that longer range precipitation forecasts don't have the same skill as a temperature outlook. However, July and August are typically our driest months of the year for many regions across BC. So, we're not expecting us to get any significant rainfall to really alleviate those deep drought conditions. Even if we see 5 to 10 millimeters over the coming weeks, it's not going to be enough to alleviate the stress we have in our forests. So if we look currently at our landscape across the province, there's a couple of different indices we can look at. And on the screen here, you have the buildup index on the left and the drought code on the right. And so the buildup index represents the total amount of fuels that are readily available to burn on July 3rd of this year. And what we've done here is we've compared it to historical values for this time of year. And we've looked at how abnormal these conditions are. We'll start with the areas in white, and that's the good news story. Throughout the eastern half of the Caribou Fire Center, down in the southern interior, most of Kamloops Fire Center, and then the Southeast Fire Center are seeing near normal conditions for this time of year. I'll draw your attention to the areas of orange and deeper dark red, namely over the northeastern corner where we've already seen our largest fires burning. Down and around the Bulkley, Nadina, Vanderhoof area is also quite dry. And then I'd like to really draw your attention to the mid-coast and the Vancouver Island area. We're observing extreme drought in those areas, or what is typically our lush, Pacific Rain Coast forest is quite dry right now and is very receptive to ignition. And I think we've really seen that in recent fires, be it the Cameron Bluff fire or a new fire that broke out near Nitnat Lake over the weekend here. We're observing, aggressive fire behavior that reflects these deeper underlying drought conditions. And then the image on the right really supports a similar story. The drought code represents the moisture content in our deeper organic layers. So if you're going to dig down in the forest into that deeper duff and look at the moisture there, you wouldn't find any, particularly again across that northeast corner, down through the central interior, and then the mid-coast and Vancouver Island. Again, very dry. If we look at the total number of fires that we've observed so far through the season, this chart tells that story. So we'll look at the black line here, ticking along as we enter, again, the core of fire season. And the black line represents the total number of fires per week in 2023. And you can see really over the past week, a solid uptick in the number of fires being reported and responded to. And on the left-hand side of this slide, we can see the total number of fires. So we've seen just over 85 fires over the last week, including those fires that Cliff spoke to over this weekend. And we've seen really good initial attack response and succession. So, 80% of those fires are being held or were declared out. So great response there. And we have a remaining 11 in the past week that remain out of control. And as we step forward now into the hot, dry pattern, I'm sure you've all heard of the little heat wave we have here unfolding over the next several days. We can expect this black line to continue to tick upward. We are expecting an increased number of fire starts here in the coming days, primarily owing to the lightning that we have forecast over the next 3 to 4 days. And speaking to that lightning, here's a chart that shows, I chose Saturday afternoon here, the occurrence of lightning that's forecast across the province. And you'll notice that it's the vast majority of the province, including a likelihood of some strikes on Vancouver Island, that are forecast here on Saturday, but also in the 2 preceding days. So Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, we're going to have 3 successive days of widespread lightning across the province into what are some very receptive fuels. So the image on the right-hand side there is our Duff moisture code. We typically look at that for the potential of ignition and receptivity to lightning. So if the fuels aren't igniting immediately, then they could perhaps hold on to that heat and ignite in the days following that lightning strike. So very active pattern that we're heading into. We've got the heat, we've got the dryness, and we're going to be throwing at that lightning across most regions of the province. So likely to see a large number of starts here in the week to come. So I'll just wrap it up here and leave you with some key messages. Our fuels are really increasingly dry and available to burn throughout most regions in the province. We're expecting a significant number of lightning strikes here in the coming days across, we'll call it the southern 2/3 and the northeast corner of the province. Again, I'd like to emphasize the importance of that coastal area and the area that is Vancouver Island. And really going forward, we don't see much relief in sight. We may see some showery patterns with, 5, 10, maybe 15 millimeters here and there, but it's not going to be enough to alleviate those deep, persistent drought conditions. And so before I hand it back to Cliff for some preparedness messaging, I'd just like to emphasize, as Cliff did, the importance to be vigilant. Just be careful when you're out there recreating in the backcountry, whether you're camping or on a motorized vehicle, and just to report those fires as soon as you see them, because that will enable us to respond as quickly as possible and extinguish those fires. So thanks for the floor time, and I'll pass it over to Cliff.
Thank you very much, Matt. And we will get to questions, I just wanted to quickly touch on a couple closing messages before we open it up for questions. And I do just want to highlight that we also have Pader Brach, Executive Director for Emergency Management and Climate Ready BC, is on the line as well. So we can take questions from emergency management and climate readiness perspective, as well as from a wildfire perspective with Matt and myself. So just to close, I think often some of the key messaging for the public is, and for communities that are in fire-prone areas, as we just saw from Matt, really that's going to be fairly widespread across British Columbia as we enter into the next 10-day period. So make sure you and your family are being prepared for what might come. And so what that means is have an emergency plan ready for you and your family. Have a grab and go kit readily available, packed with your important documents and important contact information that you may need should you be placed on an immediate evacuation order and you're going to have to leave home. So there is some preparedness activities that everybody in BC can undertake, and we encourage everybody to do so. In terms of other activities you can do to fire smart your property, I encourage everyone to go to firesmartbc.ca, where there's some valuable tools and some valuable information on how you can do your part within your own property to ensure that your grass is cut and cleaning out your gutters. And so I encourage everybody to go to firesmartbc.ca to look at some things that perhaps you want to do around your property in the next few days heading into what could be a very long 2 months of fire season, depending on the weather when we get through this little heat wave that we're in right now. I just want to end before we open up to questions, sort of with what I started with, which is I just want to recognize and thank everybody who has been putting forward such a tremendous effort in the wildfire season this year. As I said earlier, it started early. It started in mid-April, and we didn't get the seasonal sort of break that we often get when we have a spring fire season, which is the month of end of May and into June. We stayed busy. We have seen a flood of resources supporting the northern part of BC from all over BC and frankly, really all over the United States, and now with support from Mexico. These people have been working 14, 16, 18-hour days, 14 days in a row, trying to protect the landscape and the livelihoods of people who are impacted by these fires. So I want to thank the BC Wildfire Service staff who continue to show up every day, the contractors who are working with us, whether that's aviation contractors, ground resources, or heavy equipment, etc. There's a whole bunch more. Local governments and First Nation governments who have been so open and willing to work together on how we're both going to suppress the fire, but also how we're going to look after the community. It is a tremendous societal effort when we see this much fire on the landscape. And as Matt just articulated, we may start to see that come further south in the province. And we need everybody to be working together to try to get through whatever this fire season may throw at us. So we have our resources prepared for what may come with the lightning that you just saw Matt forecast for the next number of days. But the reality is we will see new starts. The conditions are such that if lightning hits and we can't track perfectly where the lightning will hit, we will see new starts in the southern part of the province as well as in the north. And we will surge our resources to those starts. But I think it's important for BC to know that we are going to see fire on the landscape with the forecast that we have in front of us today. And with that, again, I just want to thank everybody for their tremendous effort in the last 2 months and what will come in the 2 or 3 months ahead. So thank you, everyone. And with that, I'll turn it over and we'll start taking questions.
Thank you very much. And a reminder to media on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You'll be limited to 1 question and 1 follow-up. As Cliff mentioned, we have expertise on the line regarding provincial wildfire operations, forecasting, and emergency management and climate readiness. So please do direct your call to the appropriate spokesperson. Our first question today comes from Georgie Smith, CBC. Georgie, please go ahead.
Hi there. I'm just curious in regards to communities that are already facing water restrictions, wondering what the province might be doing to support just the availability of water moving forward. Have there been any conversations about supporting those communities, which in some cases are quite isolated already?
Yeah, thanks for the question. It's Pader Brach, Executive Director for Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. We have been very involved with communities in preparation for drought this season. So some of the comments you've heard today regarding the severity of drought and what we are preparing for we met early, the province met early with communities on the topic of drought and really focused on preparing for drought and providing tools to communities to really focus on water restrictions, types of tools that they could use to really ensure that they would be more be able to be more proactive in working through some of those pieces that you had mentioned. And so a number of tools that the province has provided communities to date, specifically the emergency program coordinators that work to support their community during difficult times associated with drought is, for example, draft water scarcity response planning templates we provide communities. We held sessions earlier in the year to discuss exercising those plans, and really wanted to put a lot more emphasis on drought for this season, just because of some of the weather forecasts that you're hearing. And so the province stands by to support communities that are in need to work through drought, and continues to offer those supports to communities that need it.
Georgie, do you have a follow-up?
I do, yeah. I'm just curious also with the advice of following the sort of fire smart tips to fire smart your home, which include, reducing the flammability of landscape and plants around the house. I mean, of course, there are a lot of communities that are under water restrictions that are basically going to have to watch, the areas around their houses dry out under those restrictions. Just so curious how, the general public should sort of take that advice, while also this side here is sort of acknowledging that increase in available fuel for wildfires as well. So just to sort of explain, what they're going to have to do, and probably accept that they might be increasing the fuels around their house with these water restrictions. And I just have a question for my French colleagues as well. If Matthew MacDonald could just explain in French about the new fire restrictions that are coming in, as well as English too, please.
Regarding the water and sort of the drought for focus on people's homes that you had mentioned, there are things that residents can do to support their situation. So that includes limiting outdoor watering. That includes lawns. Really recommend that people don't water during the heat of the day. And so that's really just to ensure that we're sort of protecting that valuable resource for water, to ensure that we limit the use wherever we can. So we really urge communities to be proactive in that regard, and residents to really monitor their water use and limit it wherever they can and wherever possible. And maybe for the other pieces in regards to fire smarting and field management, I'll pass it over to Cliff Chapman with BC Wildfire Service. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Pader. And it really is an excellent question. Obviously, with water restrictions in place, that's one element of Fire Smart that homeowners likely won't be able to do on a consistent basis. And that's why I encourage people to go to BC Fire Smart, firesmartbc.ca, is because there's a whole suite of activities that you can do. And really, outside of watering your lawn, there's a bunch that you can do in terms of keeping the grass short, or when your lawn meets up to maybe green space where it's a little bit longer grass, being able to shorten that grass up, cleaning out gutters. So they're, removing combustible debris from the edges of your houses. I don't want to go on and on, but I do encourage people to look, because yes, of course, water restrictions will have an impact on keeping grass green, and which is one of the Fire Smart activities, but there's a whole bunch more that we encourage the public to look at, and really valuable things like removing firewood from the edge of your house, and limbing trees that are close to your house as well. So please visit the website, and it is but again, an excellent question in terms of the balancing of hazard, the drought hazard versus the fire hazard, and trying to make it so that we can manage both. And I do think there's the ability to do that. Matt, I'll throw it to you to answer the question in French that you were asked to answer around prohibitions.
Sure, thanks Cliff, et bon après-midi Radio-Canada. Bonne question. Donc, avec les conditions de sécheresse que nous avons observées au cours non seulement du dernier mois, mais vraiment depuis l'automne passé, on a des conditions de risque de feux de forêt très élevées à travers la province. Et puis, avec la canicule là, qui s'enligne au cours des prochains jours, On a des concerns en vigueur avec le risque de foudre aussi, là, qui est à venir au cours des prochains jours. Donc, en termes d'interdiction et de restrictions en matière d'incendie, nous allons étendre là, les interdictions dans les 6 centres d'incendie à travers la province. Donc, pour que ça soit en termes de compte-feu, ça ne sera plus permis à partir de vendredi. Et puis, dans le coin sud-est de la province, ça va être les feux de catégorie 2, donc les feux de plus grande envergure qui ne seront plus permis non plus.
Thank you very much. For our next question, we will be going to Wolf Dettner of Black Press. Wolf, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you for taking my question. So Kelowna saw a wildfire just over the weekend at Knox Mountain. How many fires like that do you expect? How many fires near urban areas do you expect to see in the coming weeks and months?
Perhaps I can take a stab at that, and then I'll hand it over to Cliff for further comment. You know, the Knox Mountain fire was a great example of how receptive our fuels are, right? That was a human-started fire, and it really took off upon deployment. It had already grown to 2 hectares in size, and within 2 hours of ignition, it had grown to 6.5 hectares. So again, it reflects the receptibility of our fuels and the aggressive fire behavior once those fires start. And Canada Day was a windy one. It was actually perfect, ideal conditions for fires to grow. We had high temperatures in excess of 28 degrees Celsius. We had low relative humidities, and humidity really plays a key factor in driving our fire behavior. And then we had those strong winds. If you recall, it was a very breezy weekend across the province. And so again, ideal conditions for those fires to grow. Looking forward, you know, typically lightning strikes favor ridge tops. So outside of communities in the higher elevations, but those fires can grow downhill. And we do also get lightning strikes at valley bottom and mid elevation. So it's impossible to say exactly where and when these lightning strikes are going to occur and materialize, but the pattern is definitely conducive here in the next couple of days. We've got lots of instability right across the province, what we call high base thunderstorms, which means the precipitation, if any, falling from the base of them typically evaporates before it hits the ground. So a vast majority of these lightning strikes are anticipated to be dry and to, again, very receptive fuels. So I think really across most of the province, any area is at play here in the coming few days for new fire starts.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Really well said. And I guess all I would add is really 2 pieces. And one of them is around the prohibitions that Matt spoke about in French and I spoke about earlier in my opening. It's one of the reasons why we're seeing an increase in our prohibitions this week is that human-caused fires will draw resources away from lightning-caused fires, which obviously we can't prevent. Lightning is a natural occurring weather event that comes to BC predominantly in July and August. In terms of your question around communities being impacted or will the lightning strike near communities, I think it's just important to reflect on really the last 5 years in this province. We have seen significant impact to small communities as well as to larger communities. And those are both smoke impacts and fire impacts. And so while it's difficult to forecast whether or not we'll see lightning and a fire adjacent to an urban center or a rural community, we can't really predict that. But what I would say is with the wide scale lightning that is forecast for the next 4 days, there is as much potential for lightning to be near communities as there are in the backcountry. But as Matt said, lightning does prefer the ridge tops. So the other factor, and the last thing I'll say on this, is that just with the fuel being as dry as it is, it's those fires when they get sort of beyond our initial response. So we'll send our initial response crews, our helicopters, our air tankers, but that we don't always catch the fire at that point. We make every effort to, and it's really where will that fire want to grow long term if we can't manage it and get a handle on it. So that's the other factor when it comes to community impacts or the potential for the communities to be impacted is just where those fires end up being. And again, encourage everybody to download the BC Wildfire Service app so that you can stay kind of up to date and current on where fires are and really what those fires look like.
Wolf, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. Earlier you mentioned the pending arrival of 60 crew from the United States and 100 firefighters from Mexico. How do you plan to use these additional resources? And the sort of a part B to that question, what, if any, further resources do you expect to see arriving from outside of British Columbia? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. So with the resources coming in the next 48 hours, you're correct. It's 60 United States. Some of those are firefighters. Some of those, about 20 of them, are highly certified, what we call single resources. So they're able to take on a higher level function within our incident command structure. And then the 100 Mexican firefighters, those are all ground resources, all ground firefighters. The plan as it sits right now, and recognize that we operate very fluidly depending on what happens over the course of the next 48 hours. But the plan right now is to move all of those resources into the Prince George Fire Center to support ground operations on the fires that are currently in play, whether that's Donnie Creek or any of the large scale fires that we have in the Prince George Fire Center. Obviously, we need to be adaptable. So if something starts somewhere else in the province, we may change that plan. But that is the plan as we sit here today, is to see them go and support the Prince George Fire Center. Your follow-up question or your additional question around additional resources. So we continue to have daily, sometimes multiple times a day, we have conversations with our counterparts at CIFC, the Canadian Interagency Forest Fire Center, who manages national resources for all fire agencies across Canada. We continue to put in somewhat small requests as we continue to have resources within BC to send to fires. We know the next period is going to be active and it's going to be busy. And so we have already put placeholders in for additional resources from other areas. Right now, we're starting to see with other provinces in Canada that we're seeing some new, players come and supporting Canada in the fire effort. So we're going to see some resources go into Quebec and Ontario from the Dominican Republic, from Brazil, from Korea, and we have access to the same resource pool. And so right now there is still availability should we require it. But at this point in time, we have what's coming this week, and then we'll reassess at the end of the week to see if we need to put in an additional request.
Our next question comes from Yvonne Raymond, CTV Vancouver Island. Yvonne, please go ahead.
Hi, can you speak more specifically to the risk on Vancouver Island and what's unprecedented here so far this season, especially considering we are a heavily forested area? You mentioned that we're seeing drought conditions and have just seen a wildfire cut off access to a major highway for weeks.
Sure, I can take a go at that one as well. So if you recall, the images I showed earlier showed us where the province sits currently in terms of dryness, in terms of receptivity to lightning. And you will recall that Vancouver Island was lit up in red, showing really deep, persistent drought conditions. It's been a very dry spring. We saw less precipitation amounts over the winter period than normal. And actually the drought really stems back all the way to last fall. If you recall, last October in 2022, it was an abnormally warm and dry period, a period of the year when we typically replenish our fuels and look forward to that rainy season coming back. It did not happen last year. So this drought is nothing new. It's been long and persistent and only worsening in the last couple of weeks. And again, forecast to continue. We have no rain forecast for the foreseeable future. In the coming days here, again, we're forecasting instability across most of the province, and that includes the spine of Vancouver Island. So typically the Insular Mountain Range, the Beaufort Range that's just behind Parksville is one of the hot spots for lightning. And so there's a good likelihood here as we get into Thursday and particularly Friday that we'll see lightning strike in the higher terrain of Vancouver Island. And again, most likely not accompanied by rain into very receptive fuel. So the table is set for new starts here in the coming days, and our crews are prepped up, and they're awaiting, you know, calls and reports from the public, and we'll be chasing smoke and responding as fast as we can, because the importance is really to respond to these fires as soon as we can before they grow to a size that becomes unmanageable. You know, whether or not these fires are going to threaten highways like the Cameron Bluffs wildfire or be in remote backcountry locations, again, that's impossible to say. It's just as much as I'd like to, I cannot forecast the exact location of these lightning strikes.
Yvonne, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. Can you also speak to the smoke that is anticipated for Vancouver Island in the coming days? Typically, we get westerly winds, but I understand that that is a pattern that's shifting.
Yeah, that's right. We've already seen haze over the south coast here in the last couple of days, and a lot of that smoke is originating from the very large fires burning in the northeastern corner of BC. So we're essentially importing smoke from the northeast corner of the province, and the overall flow pattern here for the next few days is going to be persistently out of the north. So we'll continue to draw that smoke down from the Peace region, from the Amanika fires are putting out quite a bit of smoke these days. And so I would expect this haze to continue building, primarily staying at upper elevations. If we look at our air quality stations over the last couple of days, they've been picking up on slight concentrations, but nothing that really poses a risk to the health of British Columbians just yet. But again, if we fast forward 3-4 days in the future, continuing to advect that smoke southwards, we'll start filling up the airshed with more and more smoke. So I'd expect the haze to increase through Saturday. And then on Sunday, we will actually see a pattern change. We'll see an upper low that's been sitting off the coast of Vancouver Island actually track inland. And so that'll bring back the more lush and cooler Pacific air Sunday into Monday.
And speaking of the Northeast and the Peace, our next question comes from there. We hear from Rajpreet Sahota, CJDC TV. Please go ahead, Rajpreet.
Yes, hi. My question, I'm coming from Peace region, so I just had a question about the risk of the new fire starts that may be caused with the lightning strikes in the coming week or over the weekend.
Yeah, the Northeast is part of this equation for sure, where we've already seen many large fires that continue to burn, namely that Donnie Creek complex that's at over 500,000 hectares right now. We have a series of disturbances that are going to descend from the north, from the Northwest Territories and from the Yukon. And what these disturbances do is they introduce what we call atmospheric instability, which is a key ingredient for the generation of thunderstorms. And again, that signal is really from the northeast right across the central interior and down onto the south coast, including the Okanagan and the Kootenay. So, the only area not at risk here in the coming days is the far northwest corner. So for the Peace Country, the Fort Nelson area, Dawson's Creek, Tumbler Ridge, they can all expect to see lightning here in the coming days. They did take a little bit of precipitation earlier in the week or the Canada Day long weekend. So we did see some reprieve. We did see some cooler temperatures, but that was just a temporary, downturn in fire behavior. Again, I can't emphasize the pronounced drought enough in that corner of the province. And there's really no substantial rainfall in sight. We may see 5 to 10 millimeters here on Thursday and Friday in the far northeastern reaches of the province, but all that'll do is really temporarily alleviate the aggressive fire behavior that we've been observing, and then we'll be right back into the hot, dry weather next week.
Rajpreet, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. So I know that most of the resources that are coming from America are going to the Prince George Fire Center. Does that mean that all of that, or how much? What's the kind of like the number of the personnel that are coming to the Prince George Fire Center?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So at this time, the plan is to have all 160 personnel that are coming from the United States and Mexico, all 160 are heading to Prince George.
Okay, our next question comes from Alec Lazenby, BC Today. Alec, please go ahead.
Hello there. So earlier on, it was talked about how this year has already seen the third most hectares burned of any year recorded in terms of fires in BC. Thankfully, it's mostly been in rural areas, so we haven't seen a whole lot of evacuations or anything like past years. But does this year have the potential to be, the worst fire year on record in terms of hectares burned? Like, that seems to be the general message here, as well as, do you see any of the fires currently burning or potential for, evacuations needing to happen in certain areas?
It's a really good question. And it's certainly something that we started to get asked earlier on in the fire season was, is this going to be the worst fire season on record? What I would be willing to say is that I do think there is the potential that we will burn the most hectares ever recorded in BC's history this year, given that we're already over 1 million and we haven't hit our core fire season, or we're just entering into our core fire season now. So from a hectares burn perspective, yes, I believe that we may see the worst fire season on record. In terms of impacts from those fires, though, that really we won't know until we get through the next couple of months. It is worth noting that earlier on in June and even in late May, though, we did see some significant evacuation orders and alerts in the rural communities in the north, and even some of our more populated communities in the north, whether that was Fort St. John, McBride, as well as some other rural and remote communities and First Nation communities in the Northeast. So there has already been fairly significant impacts on the public and on communities, maybe not to the scale of 17 and 18 yet. And again, that's going to be very dependent on where the lightning tracks, making sure that we are detecting fires as quickly as we can. And that's really another call to the public to call in smoke when you see it. And we will respond to it to make sure that anytime there is a potential new start, that we can put as many resources as we have available onto that new start to ideally avoid additional impacts to communities. Really, in terms of comparative to 17, 18, and 21, 3 of our worst fire seasons on record in terms of impacts, we're really going to have to wait and see through July and August. But what I would say is the conditions are such that we have potential to see quite a bit more fire on the landscape.
Okay, our next, sorry, Alec, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. In terms of, what the province is doing, so this is more of a question for emergency management and climate readiness, is the 17, 18, 21, and now 23, like massive fire years, lots of hectares burned, massive impact on communities. Just wondering, what are the province's plans to sort of alleviate the impacts of this? Like, there's been recommendations for more prescribed burning, for fuel breaks, things of that nature. If we're going to keep seeing these fire seasons get worse and worse, what is the province doing to lessen the impact on British Columbians of, every summer we get into this situation again?
Yeah, Pader Brach with Emergency Management Climate Readiness. The province has learned a lot from previous fire seasons and the impacts, of course, to communities and the public. And it's one of the reasons why we ended up modernizing some of the approaches that we take for supporting evacuees, specifically the emergency support services that we do provide evacuees. We recently digitized that service so that evacuees and people can not only register in a more timely way, but also pre-register prior to an evacuation occurring. And so we're always focused on improving our approach to supporting evacuees, and the planning doesn't end with just some of those improvements that we have made over the last few years based on some of the seasons that you had mentioned. We continue to support and work with communities on evacuee planning to really ensure that we're capturing some of the scenarios that may result in larger evacuees, but really wanted to emphasize that it's very important for residents to have their personal preparedness in order so that they do have what Cliff referred to as the grab-and-go bags ready. They are prepared to leave immediately when required. We know from past fire seasons that the fires can move very quickly, and there's sometimes limited time for people to get organized. And so it's really important for that personal preparedness piece to be at the forefront of everyone's minds for this summer, with the knowledge that the province continues to plan, work directly with local governments and First Nation communities on planning for evacuations, and that we will continue to support British Columbians when that does occur.
And just specifically on the wildfire investments, BC saw the largest budget increase to BC Wildfire Service over the course of the last 2 years. Significant portion of that increase in our budget was to do wildfire prevention and mitigation activities. So we've doubled our prevention budget in BC Wildfire Service to increase wildfire risk reduction activities on the land base, that being Crown land. We've also increased the grant dollars through the Union of BC Municipalities to the tune of $100 million into that fund, where communities can access those funds to hire positions, fire smart type positions. They can do planning work, and then they can execute that work to try to make their communities more resilient to wildfire. So that fund is in play right now. There's also was an investment into Forest Enhancement Society of BC, which is a Crown agency that additionally can grant out dollars for wildfire risk reduction activities and fiber utilization, which is another big investment from government over the course of the last 2 years. The other one that you spoke to, which I think is really critical as well as we continue to move out of this fire season into the future fire seasons, is cultural and prescribed fire. It is a tool that we need to continue to invest and learn from our First Nation partners out there in terms of utilizing fire on the landscape, as well as working with industry and other stakeholders on reapplying fire on the landscape in conditions where it is far easier to control it. And so you will see, and you may have already seen, that BC Wildfire Service, in partnership with First Nation communities and other local contractors and local governments, we have increased our cultural and prescribed fire program significantly in the last year. And we plan to continue to push the continued use of cultural and prescribed fire as a risk reduction tool for BC. And then the final piece I'll touch on, which is more at the ministry level, is this investment in forest landscape planning, really bringing the community-centered approach to planning the landscape around those communities, and having tables that are made up with local governments, First Nation governments, provincial government ministries, stakeholders, contractors, partners, to really try to plan the landscape for the next 10 years, which is, obviously in BC needs to be inclusive of fire and other hazards. And so as that's rolling out, we're starting to see the benefits of having a more robust and holistic landscape plan for this province.
Next question comes from Mary Brooke, Island Social Trends. Mary, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for taking my question. So I'm just wondering if you feel that the public is responding adequately to your messaging about fire smart and emergency preparedness. I mean, that sort of education piece has been going on for several years, more locally perhaps. I'm just wondering, do you have any metrics? Do you have any data about how many people have prepared grab-and-go bags, that sort of thing?
So I'll ask Pader to speak to the grab and go bags. Maybe I'll just speak more generally, and I apologize. I know you asked for metrics, but what I can say is that it is my belief, and BC Wildfire Service's belief, that the public is far more sort of attuned to what's happening in terms of fire and fire weather. We see far more preparedness. We see the fires that I spoke about over the long weekend. We had 46 of them. We received over 1,000 calls into our call center, which is phenomenal, right? I mean, there wasn't 1,000 fires, there was 45 fires, and that's what we want. That's really what we're encouraging the public from a detection standpoint to be for us. In terms of fire smart and prevention and risk reduction activities, so many of the programs that we've really rolled out the last number of years, they're partnership programs. They are in conjunction with communities, with First Nation communities, done in partnership with BC Wildfire Service and or the Ministry of Forests. And so we're seeing that, we're really seeing that partnership approach to these hazards. And honestly, that is the way forward. That is how we need to approach hazards in BC. and it's working. So happy to report back with metrics after the call. But at this point, I would say from a wildfire perspective that the public has been extremely responsible and responsive sort of to this call to action that fire is a naturally occurring event in BC, and we need to become more resilient and more, reduce the risk and impacts to communities and infrastructure. Pader, I'm not sure if you wanted to add.
Yeah, thanks, Cliff. The communities certainly that have experienced fires in the past know that it's possible for them to experience them in the future. And so we do know in British Columbia that there's definitely experienced community members with working through fire seasons like they have in the past. In regards to the grab and go bags question, the emphasis that I would like to place on grab and go bags is that personal preparedness, you can never do enough of it. And we really do encourage residents and people that live throughout British Columbia to really have that preparation at the front of their minds during the hazard seasons. And that can include flooding, right now, and of course the focus is in wildfire. And it's really important. So, I think the metrics that would be best defined for how prepared British Columbians are with their own personal preparedness is really the grab and go bag, whether they have one, and whether they have the pieces of that kit that are required. And so that includes, their identification, insurance papers, medication, cash, things that would support their pets. And I think for British Columbia, we find that when residents evacuate and go to reception centers, there's often a variety of levels of preparedness. And so I think that although we see some British Columbians are well prepared in that regard, I think there's always room for all of us collectively to improve on that. And I really urge anyone that's listening to this, if you don't have a grab and go bag packed for your family, to really emphasize that as a priority for you. And I think that will be the true testament to the level of preparedness, both in mindset and personal preparedness as far as your supplies and gear that you need for a limited notice evacuation alert that may move to an evacuation order very quickly. So thank you for the question.
Mary, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, thank you. So it's quite remarkable how Vancouver Island has sort of risen to the red zone on your maps. I think most people still think of the island as a cool, temperate, wet place. So do you think that this is, it's hard to predict the weather, but do you think that the unusual year we're having in 2023, which as you say stemmed back to fall 22, is a one-off? And as opposed to kind of predicting the weather, where I'm going with that is people's mindset about, should we now expect this to be a regular thing, to have a warm, extra warm and dry Vancouver Island experience in summer going forward?
Yeah, great question. I think we can't ignore climate change in all of this. 7 of our 10 busiest fire seasons have all occurred in the last 10 years. You think to other atmospheric events like the heat dome of 2020, the atmospheric rivers of 2021, we're seeing exactly what climate change experts have been alerting us to, which is a higher frequency of extreme weather events. Not only that, but with the reduction of Arctic sea ice, that's diminishing what we call a temperature gradient. So the north to south temperature differences, which is what drives our jet stream. And the jet stream is really a key driver in our progressive weather patterns. And so as the jet stream weakens, we see a much larger frequency of what we call blocking patterns. Excuse me. And so in the past week, we've seen what we call an omega block, which is a persistent blocking ridge of high pressure that's shifting flavors, if you will, to become a Rex block. So these blocking patterns are becoming a lot more persistent, a lot more frequent, and they're switching up our more transient weather patterns to prolonged periods of wetness or prolonged periods of dryness and heat. And so, the drought that we're seeing here on Vancouver Island is, it's not the first time we've seen this in the past 5 to 6 years. We've seen other springs and summers that have been exceptionally dry up and down Vancouver Island. That's resulted in low stream flows. in pronounced deep drought conditions, be it in the forest landscape or the water supply side of things. And yeah, going forward, again, I think we can expect a more frequent occurrence. This doesn't mean that we're not going to see nice, lush, green, rainy summers and springs. It just means that on average, as we continue forward here, we can expect these conditions to persist. And from a smoke perspective, I think back to the fall of 2020, I think it was, when we inherited smoke from some south of the border. So it's not just about how conditions are in our own backyard, but really thinking more holistically and globally about conditions. I mean, we sometimes import smoke from as far as Siberia. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that these events are here to stay. People can adapt and prepare because they're not going away. And so thinking about fire smarting your home, your community, having those grab and go bags ready, and preparing for smoke events and extreme heat events and the associated increased fire activity.
And our last question today goes to Lauren Collins of the Black Press. Lauren, please go ahead.
Hi. For international firefighters, you noted that you're making smaller requests. How many did BC ask for compared to the 160 that are coming? Is it tighter for resources with other provinces dealing with major fires?
Thank you for the question. So we obviously work with our partner agencies across Canada. The primary agencies that are active right now are Quebec, Ontario, Alberta, and BC. And then there's varying degrees of activity in the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Saskatchewan, Manitoba. The East received quite a bit of precip, so the Maritimes are not really a factor in this. So we collaborate agency to agency and multi-agency to discuss best use of resources coming from other nations, coming from the rest of Canada. And they are, it's really it's a very collaborative space to try and some of these resources recognize that we've never seen in Canada before. And so the first agency that receives staff and firefighters from the Dominican Republic or Korea, it's about understanding their skill sets and how they translate into how we fight fire in Canada. Obviously, there's some language barriers that we have tools and practices to overcome. So what we're finding is that we're not getting any no's. When we ask for things, we're not getting a no, that doesn't exist. Often because in BC, we're really trying to attempt to ask proactively. So looking into next week and the week after that to say, next week we believe we might need 100 more firefighters. And so we'll put that request in a week or a week and a half early, and we're finding great success with that. So I guess to answer your question, we have not received any no's from CIFC, the Canadian Interagency Center, but we have had to adjust some of our requests just in terms of timing due to availability.
Do you have a follow-up, Lauren?
Yes, I do. You also said that there were, I think, more than 1,000 calls over the weekend for about 45 fires, and 36 of those were held or put out. Has constant reminding to BC residents to be more aware of reporting helped in that?
Yeah, I think the public deserves a lot of credit in British Columbia. As we see, and even right now, we're living in a state of there's smoke in many of our valleys, especially as you go further and further north. And so aerial detection becomes very challenging for us because aircraft have to divert around the smoke. Legally, they're not allowed to fly through it if it's a certain visibility. And so with the public for years have actually done a phenomenal job reporting wildfires in BC. I think the inclusion of a mobile app and the simplicity of being able to report a fire from the mobile app, I think has allowed for even an additional response from the public to be able to report fires because there's now the ability to essentially using SMS or text to be able to report a fire, and you can attach a photo to the app as well, which is super helpful for our organization so we can see what you see and make determinations around, fairly quickly around air tankers and helicopters. And so, really simply to answer your question, I think the public in BC has been doing a phenomenal job, and really the encouragement now is just keep it up and don't think that just because we had 1,000 calls for 45 fires, that's too many. It's not. We would have been happy with 2,000 calls on the same 45 fires, because when we're filled with smoke in this province, really it is, you know, all the people that live here that become the eyes for BC Wildfire Service, and for us to be able to recognize where new fires start.
Thank you very much, everyone. That concludes today's availability.